Welcome back, and we're in episode 17. Thanks for returning with us. And remember that you'll need a login to engage in the activities that you see presented here. And last time, we got into story maps with both the classic version and the current version, those wonderful templates and the exciting new current template that can do all kinds of things all in one, with the discussion of projects and design and doing some collaboration. And we got to the end last time and said, wow, there's so much more to go through. So yes, indeed, we're going to keep working on those sections during this hour, with adding in a look at the ArcGIS online competition for high school and middle school students as a look at how our students working with these tools to do some reporting about projects that they've done. So more on that as we get into it. Let's jump in right away. We've got a lot to cover today. And so Joseph is going to get us started. And Joseph, if you're ready, I'm going to stop sharing.
Absolutely. Thanks, Charlie. Well, Kylie and I are going to share two blocks of thinking about and using and creating story maps with you all today. The first block is going to be improving work. How do you improve your work in story maps, tips in authoring? And then in the second section, we're going to talk about possibilities and expand your horizons. The first map we'd like to show you is one of our favorite teaching resources. Remember, existing story maps, and as Charlie mentioned, they number in the hundreds of thousands. And indeed, at the end of 2019, I believe we went over 1 million story maps created globally. And so many of these are wonderful teaching resources. One of our favorites is this Living in the Age of Humans, or the Anthropocene, what many scientists call, because the heavy impact of humans on so many aspects of the planet. This particular one, there's a couple of things that we'd like to point out. First of all, we sort of had a light touch on this, but you can embed graphs, interactive graphs in these story maps, photographs, maps, immersive experiences. Wow, these are really compelling images, aren't they? And yes, interactive maps as well, showing the impact of agriculture, population, and other things that make this really the age of the humans, the 7.5 billion of us. And yes, interactive maps and imagery. One of the things that we wanted to show with these story maps is that if you're teaching environmental science, geography, a couple of other subjects here, you can use this whole collection, and we'll talk about collections in a moment, of the age of the Anthropocene. It's not just one map, but it actually has multiple chapters, as you can see up in the upper right, Living in the Age of Humans. Another thing that we wanted to point out in this section is two things with this particular story map. This one touches on, remember we were talking about, as you get immersed in the world of using geospatial technologies, you start to know and be familiar with certain authors. This one in particular, John Nelson, he's one of our cartographers at Esri. And so I gravitate to, every time John posts a map, I take a look at it, because it's usually something pretty interesting, including teaching with J.R.R. Tolkien types of themes in his maps. But this one is of particular importance nowadays. The one I wanted to show at the end, though, is our subject that we briefly raised last time, and that is credits, right? Remember metadata. In the story maps tools, there is a section where you can add sources and authors and data sets that you're pulling from. It's really important because, again, if you're going to share this, you want to practice what you would like other people to do. You want to be able to populate your own maps with this source information at the end, just like you would like to see other people do the same thing, and your students doing the same thing. So this one is a nice, just right, I think. It's a nice balance between not too much and not too little. John explains how he made the maps in a blog. He also talks about the sources. Another thing is, if you're going to create these maps in this wonderful web-based GIS environment that we have at our fingertips nowadays, you want to be able to say, okay, if I'm going to share this, even inside my own organization, that means that these maps are fed with dynamic content, as you well know. That means that if you're going to share, you're going to take responsibility for curating these maps, right? You're going to say, okay, I'm committed now to spending time periodically reviewing this, making sure that all the data sources work. So this particular one is a nice story about someone's journey over their course of their career. But notice in this last frame, this particular image is really broken. And so this person needs to really go in there. I can't do it. You can't do it. It's the author that has to do it. So there'll be things like that that you may see occasionally in your story maps that need to be updated, need to be fixed. All right, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kylie, now.
Thanks, Joseph. That was great. So one of the things as you were talking, there were two that really jumped out at me that I'm going to talk about right now. One of them that you mentioned was sharing and other people using these. And the other one you talked about was the metadata and the information. It reminded me of two things with our map, our story map that we made in the last episode. The first is, I know that when I share this with people, and my mom was a teacher, so she's going to love to see what we're doing with this project. She always looks at it wherever I sent it to her. And she and I text a lot. So often I text her a URL and she's just going to click on it. So how is that going to work on a mobile device? All right. So one of the cool things is we did use the newer template for a story map. And so I'm going to just show this on a screen here today, where I'm going to take my browser window and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make it smaller. We'll minimize some other stuff so we can really focus on this one window. But just to let you guys know, your story map is going to behave pretty well on a mobile device. As you can scroll down, you can see the content we put in is still there. We've got some fixes for navigation to let it still work, but it isn't broken at these smaller screen sizes. And I think that's important because right now, how often are people using a tablet? How often are they using their phone to review the content? There's one other example of this that I want to show quickly, and I'll be showing this map later as well. But this is a map that I've made, and I'll look at it more later, but it's about favorite colors. And it has quite a number of things in it. And so it's a great example of how when we resize our screen, we can still work with the content. In particular, there's a survey here. And look at this size, it's a little tile, and I can open it and work with the survey. Well, if I take the same web map or story map and I go full screen, that survey is right here. It's embedded right in the content. So on a mobile device, the story map is smart enough to fix some of these components for me. Again, further down, you'll see that we have a dashboard right in this story map. Don't get too distracted by it right now because we'll go explore it. When I go to my smaller screen, again, my dashboard isn't going to work great right here embedded into this other page. So we're able to access it, but we're kept good experience for a mobile device. And again, those are things the story map just does for us. Now, really quick, because I want to show this other important fact, when we did our story map, we used that app, right? And we made our story map. So I'm going to jump it back into this full-size screen again, and we're going to look at where we made our story map, right? It was in this experience. It was in the storymaps.arcgis.com. Well, what that really did was it made a file, and here I've gone to my content, signed in as the same user in my org, and you can see here is that story map. It's an item in my organization, just like a map, just like a layer that I've published, okay? And as part of that, that has an item page. And you've seen these in past episodes when we talked about metadata, about tagging. Well, even your story maps do that work, because then if someone else wants to use your work, as Joseph was showing in the credits, they can learn a little bit about how you made it and what you did and get the information they need. And again, all of the things we looked at before, there is your summary, there is a description. Only the summary is filled out as you're creating this in the story map app. And important again is the tags. Now in this one, I've added a tag already for episode 16, because remember, when you go to our hub, you'll be able to click a link and get all the resources we showed in that episode. And we actually do that through tags. So for this project in particular, those tags are important. All right, Joseph, back to you.
Thanks, Kylie. I've got a couple of additional things to share. In our theme of tips for authoring success. This particular short section is going to be about balancing too much versus too little. Remember, the objective of story mapping is to communicate an issue, a problem, a topic clearly and concisely, really. I love the quote from Mark Twain when asked about one of his novels. He said, "If I had had more time, I would have made it shorter." You've probably said this to your students as well. You don't need to go on and on, right? It doesn't have to be your master's thesis. A story map is meant to communicate in a short amount of space. That's what maps have always had appeal to do, is a large amount of information in a short amount of space. So I just leave these few up to you. You decide whether you think this is too much. I love this one, for example, The Year of Coexistence by the Defenders of Wildlife. It has all kinds of different animals and how they exist or coexist with people and how that attitude has changed and morphed over time. But as you can see, way up in the upper corner there, perhaps you can see my size of my scroll bar. It's like this big. So every one of these frames is about 1/100th of the total width of this map, or length of this map, I should say. So maps, bears, tigers, wolves, etc. There's a lot of content here, no doubt about it. And you as the educator, you, just like other resources, you decide whether this is appropriate for your needs. Many people would say this is too much, but on the other hand, us as educators, wow, this is fascinating. But again, you decide what the most appropriate resource is for your instruction. You could use just sections of this. Another one is from, this is really fascinating stuff. This one's got tabs in it. It's produced by the Infomar people in Ireland, and it's got these wonderful layers of historical maps scanned in, along with shipwrecks over time. So you've got different sections of the coast of Ireland with this spyglass technique, and you can look at the hydrographic survey of the sea bottom along with historical ships over time that have wrecked, sadly, off the coast. There's a lot of content in here. Again, you as the educator get to decide and encourage your students to be critical of these maps as well, right? Maps aren't perfect just because they're maps, and maps aren't perfect just because they're online. Be critical of data, including maps. You ask your students all the time, I'm sure, do you believe everything you see on the internet? No. Then you shouldn't believe every map that you see, right? Maps are very powerful and they should be viewed critically. Another thing that we wanted to point out to you all is that we have, as you'll see in the story map zone, a set of collections. These collections are really wonderful because they're all focused on a certain theme. Now, my colleagues and I happen to be filming this on Earth Day, so happy Earth Day to you all. And this particular collection obviously is about Earth Day. So you can choose what you want to teach about and what you and your students would like to learn about in the aspect of Earth and in the environment. So that's the Earth Day collection. You'll see others on the Story Maps site. This is one of my favorites. Alan Carroll, who actually founded the whole Story Maps program here at Esri, he's got a Story Maps in the Digital Humanities. So in here are historical and sociological and other art, etc., collections of things. So really well done, thoughtful stories. Alan's a very thoughtful guy, and his team and he very carefully put together these. So again, we're a tiny bit hesitant to show these just because realize that you can't go from knowing maybe nothing about story maps to creating something like this. Some of these actually took weeks to make. So again, give yourself time and space to embark on the journey, but the key is to start. So those are a couple of collections that we wanted to show. Another thing that we wanted to get across to you all is, I'm going to pull up this other window, if you don't mind. I'm going to go over here. I'm now inside my ArcGIS Online organizational account. Let me widen this window just a little bit. And I've got a map, for example, called How Walkable is Your Community? It's a story map that has a survey inside of it and a couple of videos, and et cetera. It's about walkability of communities and why that's important. One of the techniques that, one of the capabilities that just came into being here recently that we're all excited about is under this zone up here in the upper right of when you're authoring a story map. So think about, okay, I'm authoring now, I'm in edit mode, all those things that we showed last episode are at my fingertips, changing fonts, adding things with that plus sign, etc. But one of the new things, as you'll see, is duplicate story. This is kind of like a save as when you're authoring something like a Word doc, right, or a PowerPoint. You can save as. Why do you do that in a story map? Well, just like you do in other tools. If I want a copy of it and then just adjust the copy. So if I duplicate that story, yes, duplicate that story. It's going to make a copy of it inside my ArcGIS Online organizational account, and it's going to have a slightly different name. Probably we'll check it out in a moment. Okay, now it says copy. And what if I want to do something like how much litter is in your community? Now take out this copy here, right? Okay, so now if I save that, right? If I publish that, and I'm just going to share it with my own organization. I should, if I go to content, I should have my walkability map. Hey, nice work, thanks. I'm going to go to the content and just check it out. All right, so I'm going to refresh this page. You see my how walkable is your community map showing right on top, and then I've got how much litter is in your community. So that's so powerful. I can spend some quality time, and so can my students, on making a story map. And then I want to adjust it slightly to be a different theme, but largely have the same structure. Very powerful to be able to do that. Okay, I'm going to turn it back to my colleague Kylie right now to continue with our story maps discussion.
All right, Joseph, again, you're just saying things that get me thinking of other things I want to make sure we share with the viewers today. And one of them is you were talking about this process of not having something and getting to have something. Like, how do you get started? There are all these resources. There's so much in them. And it reminded me of a program we do for students. And Charlie's going to talk about this a little bit later in this episode. But we have an Arcgis online competition for U.S. high school and middle school students. And in that, what they actually create is a story map. Now, the reason it jumped to my mind is most of these students may not have created story maps before. And so as part of the program, we put together some guidelines for them. These are directed at that competition, but these guidelines could be applied in any project. So I just wanted to share where these exist for people who do want to see a couple tips on creating good story maps and the types of content to put in. Now, if we scroll down in this article, you can see this section on design and judging. And in particular, I want you to look at, there's a visual supports. Okay, so in this particular competition, it's a map-centric exploration. So they remind you of things of how to keep your story map focused on the map, right? Limit the amount of video you have. Limit the number of images total, and especially the number of images that you didn't create as part of your project, because in this case, we're looking for original work by students, and we really want them to own the pieces. Now, again, not all of this will apply to any project you're doing, but they are some useful things to consider. Another great tip in here is the short URL. Of having a short URL, it's going to make it much easier for people to find your story. And down here, these project tips. A reminder, again, like we've been talking about, of looking at some examples before you get started. You might get some good inspiration there, and hold that thought because we're about to get into that even more. But then a good story map, orient your reader. Make sure it's interactive, exploratory. This isn't designed to be a web page of static content, but really interactive. So keep that in mind as you're designing these. Just some good reminders of how we can get good content in it. Now, I know I just said one of them is looking at other content to get inspired and some ideas. And I know that's what we wanted to talk about in our next section, Joseph. So I'm going to hand it back over to you so you can kick off that part.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Kylie. This part is really important. It may seem dry and boring, but it is really critical. And just like you have your students cite their sources, when you're making story maps, remember that they're multimedia. Designed that way so that you're going to be, and your students are going to be looking at all sorts of different images, many caution points required here in instruction, to be sure. But one of the things that Kylie's nudging us to do, and I'm nudging you to do as well, is think about just because an image is out there does not mean you can use it in your report, in your story map, in other content, right? A good rule of thumb, for example, this Sounds of Planet Earth story map, all of the sounds that I actually have in this are my own recorded sounds. If I didn't have those, I could go out and try to find images or sounds that are U.S. federal agencies that generally that information is not copyrighted, although there are a few exceptions. Wikimedia, Creative Commons, look carefully at the at the permissions, but oftentimes educational use permitted, okay? And if you don't have any of those, or it's not your own source, then ask permission, right? So Bob's Photos Inc. If I'm going to use a photo from Bob's Photos Inc., if there was such a thing, which I assume there is, then I'm going to ask Bob if I truly want to use one of Bob's images. I'm going to ask permission. So this is actually one of those reasons why we all love teaching with geotechnologies, because it touches on so many other things that are important, even beyond spatial analysis. It really, really does. All right. In this section also, we wanted to expand your horizons, just get you kind of thinking. We're not going to deluge you with tons and tons of story maps, but we wanted to get you thinking a bit larger beyond the basics of story maps. And I'm going to start with this one right here, Kylie, because inside this Sounds of Planet Earth story map, this is just my description of how I created it, how I stored the sounds. This is the actual, it's 100 sounds, waves, pebbles, walking along the road, cars. And the reason why I wanted to bring it up is to get you thinking about, sounds. Oftentimes we think of videos and photographs, but sounds are interesting too. They're good teachable multimedia. And inside here, for example, I just have these little players, and the beauty, the wonder of these tools is that you don't have to know much coding. In fact, most of the stuff that we've been teaching in the mapping hour, you don't need to know any coding. Here's a couple of things that I have in here that are little HTML-y kinds of strings of code, nothing complicated, and I do explain those on the blog. But that's how I put the sound in here. Once you click on the sound, and you're not going to be able to hear it on this session right now, but I'd say, that is, I don't know, what is that, waves? What is that sound? And then view score, so I have this going out to a Google form that's a quiz, basically. You can think about it that way. And then it returns with the possibilities. Okay, the feedback. This is the old walled section of Tunis in Tunisia. That is the sound. It's the old Medina, the old market, center city. So I have feedback in the story map. Wasn't too complicated to do. That was one of the things that I wanted to share. Another thing I wanted to share here is this one. Remember how Charlie and my other colleagues actually have been talking about the geographic inquiry process? Asking a question is so important, and gathering data and analyzing the data. What I like about this one is, besides the fact that it was created by a middle school student about right whales in the Gulf of St. Lawrence off of Canada, my favorite thing about what the student did, besides all of that other stuff, is right at the end, the student talks about how do we solve this problem? It's not just here's the problem, but she actually goes in and analyzes a couple of solutions, including these having to do with fishing and lobster traps. I love that, because it's not just here's the problem and it's serious and what are we going to do about it, but here are some things we can do about it. I really like that. I really like the ACT section in this one. I'm going to turn it back over to Kylie now.
All right, I'm getting ideas already of the things I want to go make story maps about later. But for now, I'll think about some ones that I already know I like so I can share with you. So we saw this one a little bit earlier when we were looking at the mobile experience, and it's on mapping favorite color. And this is one I put together recently, and what I think was really fun about it was it kind of introduces the concept of GIS through a story map and uses some of the different types of pieces we can put together to really help someone understand how they can participate in some of this GIS process. So in this story map, you'll see there is, as I mentioned before, there's an embedded survey. So someone can fill this out, and right as they scroll, they'll then see their own dot reflected on the map. So we're taking some of these different things we've learned over the course of the mapping hour, like creating surveys, creating maps, and in a second, a dashboard, and put them all into your story map. So instead of having to send someone, oh, here's a link to my survey, go fill it out. Here's a link to my map, you can look at the results. Here's a link to a dashboard, let's analyze the results of it. And even in this one, I'm going to scroll down a bit so you can see it. There's that dashboard I mentioned. In here, we've even have some other maps where we're doing some more analysis, looking at a heat map and some other types of things that we've played with, looking at heat maps by color, for example, and toggling colors on. And so I ended up using the story map kind of as a delivery vehicle. So I don't have to send out a bunch of different links. I don't have to hope people can figure out the connection between the map I sent them and the dashboard I sent them, but really helping them make that connection and tying it into, well, one story, right? That's the whole point. We have all these cool pieces we've built. Let's now tie it together. So one thing I really found powerful here was just, again, that idea that someone could come in and provide their own information for the map and then immediately see it. So I'm sure you can think of other types of surveys you may want to do where the person taking the survey would like to see what other people have done. And this is one way you can present that. Another story map idea, well, we've talked a little about this. So one thing you as a teacher can do is go explore this vast quantity of story maps that have been created, right? And one thing to keep in mind when you're reviewing it is these show content, right? There are some amazing authors who've put together some really compelling story maps, and you can use it in your classroom to teach content or teach a concept, right? We've done that with GeoInquiries, right? We're helping you take content and concepts that you need to cover as part of your curriculum and give a mapping twist to it, a different way to explore it, to maybe visualize that same information. Some students that might really resonate for. It's just adding to your toolbox of things that you as a teacher can do to make your content be memorable, stand out in someone's mind, and continue through as they go through their schooling. So this is an example of one of the story maps I really like when thinking about teaching content, because it looks at world ecosystems, it looks at the ecological land we have. Now, this is a very long story map, so you do need to think about the things Joseph was talking about how you as the teacher need to kind of curate this material. Maybe this isn't appropriate for your class, but maybe it is, or maybe you want to tell them certain slides to focus on. For example, over on the side here, you could jump right to a particular one and say, this is the region that we want to focus on right now. So you as the teacher can take this material, curate it a little bit, understand what you want to use it for, and communicate that to your students. One of the really interesting things with this story map, similar to what Joseph was showing with some of the story maps he just looked at, is there is an accompanying blog that talks about how it was made. And in this case, it was actually a culmination of some years of research and work that was done. And it's great to see it presented in a way that even our students can scroll through and learn something. All right, the last thing that I wanted to show is a quick look at a blog. Take a look at this blog. Now, you've heard Bern's name before, and he is one of our prolific bloggers who shows some great ideas and concepts of how to do things or a new way to think about an application of one of our tools. Very inspirational, just the different types of projects you can come up with. And he has this great blog about things you didn't know you could do with story maps. Well, that's pretty much exactly what we're talking about right now, right? There's this tool, it's a story map. Yes, you can put a map and put some text around it. But what else can you do? Are you limited to that? What kind of projects, perhaps, could you use this as a final presentation on? Well, let's see what he did. Annual reports. Okay, that wouldn't have been the first thing I thought of, but you can do it. And again, other choices. Introducing your staff or your company. Hey, I know there's one of these for the education team somewhere out there, right? These are a fun way to get people to flip through, learn something. A resume. All right, so I've just covered a few in here. Promoting and mark. Okay, I've got to stop scrolling because I just get excited about all these different things I never would have thought to do with a story map. So think about, even if your project doesn't seem like it's a mapping project, is geography part of it? Is there a location aspect to it? Is it something that maybe we want to help the reader of our project and our research understand maybe the scope or the region, and then evolve this bigger story? Well, story maps can be used for that. Don't think of it as limited to, I'm talking about a map, but really think about all these different types of projects you can use it in. All right, so now that we're talking projects again, I'm going to turn it on over to Tom to talk a little bit more about some of these projects and designs and considerations.
Thanks, Kylie. So Kylie and Joseph just walked us through some great examples of what we can do with story maps, and also taught us a little bit about the technology behind them and how we can advance our own understanding of building with them. We want to revisit some project design concepts as we begin to step away from story maps, and just remind folks of the 5 stages of geographic inquiry that we believe best helps scaffold a student's work as they begin to build in story maps. And remember, the beginning of the cycle starts with a great question. That question helps design and inform every element of the resulting story map. From that question, we go into acquiring data, oftentimes using some sort of data collection form like a survey 1, 2, 3 or collector. We then explore that data to find some basic patterns and trends in it before actually moving into the analysis tools to make some geographic statements of analysis about what we're seeing, what we're examining. And finally, this process of ACT, which really isn't a finale at all. Remember, ACT is a kind of a checkpoint. It's a process wherein we make some artifact that describes our learning, that describes what we found as we investigated that question. And of course, what we are proposing is that you or students or your children would use story maps to help build out that documentation, that artifact of learning in the ACT phase. And of course, because it's in the geographic inquiry cycle here, oftentimes that ACT is going to re-inform a new question or direct us to a new question, and it's going to start that whole process all over again. Now, one thing that was highly recommended to me is that when we have students create when students create projects and use story maps to articulate the findings of that project, also consider have students developing kind of an elevator pitch, a 1-minute description of their project and of their story map, so that they have a verbal accompaniment that goes along with that story map. Because depending on the setting the students are using it in, that ability to verbally explain what's going on is very powerful, particularly if you're dealing with an audience that may be fast moving. So very briefly, we want to help create some metacognition around the learning processes here. And in order to do that, we want to think about a concept called Tpac. And this is grown increasingly popular, especially in the space of educational technology and instructional design for those in formal education. It's really the idea that whenever we start working with technologies like story maps or like GIS, we're doing so in the context of at least two other domains of knowledge that we could summarize as content knowledge or subject area knowledge, as well as pedagogy. And pedagogy is that ability to teach effectively using a variety of instructional methods or strategies. And in this case, what we've really been arguing is that an educator or a parent would use a project-based approach or a question-based approach to help organize the learning for educators. Learning for students. So as we think about technology and content and pedagogy in our diagram here, we can see that there's overlap. There's overlap between tech and pedagogy. There's overlap between tech and content. Really the sweet spot, though, for making these amazing types of artifacts with things like story maps is when you hit that sweet spot right in the middle of all three. This requires a learner or a guide, such as a parent or educator, to be at least familiar with, if not expert in, these three areas, these three Tpac areas. So if you are, for example, new to working with projects and student learners, think about where your strengths or maybe weaknesses lie in each of these areas. And if need be, explore some resources to help strengthen those areas for you. It'll make your work as a guide better, and it'll make your student artifacts, your student products better. So this process, as you've probably figured out by now, managing the instruction, managing the content, and blending it with this cool technology, all in the context of geography, of course, in this case, sometimes it's challenging. What you're looking at on screen is something called a diffusion curve, and it tries to describe an adoption rate of various technologies, in this case, technologies that might be used in learning. And the interesting thing about this that you may note is that on the far left are the first adopters. They're the innovators, and it's a very small group of people. So it may be 2.5% of parents would be in that innovative class of parents that are engaging students in a particular type of learning or learning technology. And as we slide up and over that curve, we reach different types of audiences that are educating that have different characteristics. The reason this is important is because most people will fall into the majority, right? Either the early majority or the late majority. And oftentimes this also might describe our level of engagement, expertise, energy, however you want to however you want to characterize it. But it's something to think about, because when we think about the use of materials to help student learning, sometimes these materials are great places to start working. So for most people, we describe, as we did in episodes, I think 1 through 5-ish, the idea of using mainstream presentation type activities. And we refer to those, in this case, as geo-inquiries. Those are great starting points for almost everybody. And as your skills as an instructor, as a guide advance, and as your students or your children's skills advance with the technology and the subject content, you can drop down our inverted triangle into more and more advanced methods. So starting with mainstream presentation type stuff and moving into effectively scripted content. So these two, again, include geo-inquiries. It might include some of the learn content. Might even include some of those online training courses and MOOCs you can take from Esri if you like. As you continue to drop down, you end up in guided projects and then finally in student projects. Those guided projects are typically created by you, the adult, whether you're an educator or parent, and as your students or children become masters of that work and iterate on those cycles, they will oftentimes identify their own research questions. And this is really both of these bottom sections is really where we think people should strive to be, where their learning excels and moves forward at an amazing pace. And they produce some beautiful work products. Lastly, we wanted to key you in on a couple of things. If this whole process is still feeling a little bit concerning for you, over the next 2 episodes, we're going to take 4 deep dives into working with projects. And of course, it's your 4 hosts here. We are each going to pick out one of our favorite topical areas and take you into an example of how it's used or how it was built or why we think it's awesome for your consideration. So be sure to check in on episodes 18 and 19 as we take those deep dives into additional content. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Charlie.
Thanks, Tom. Tom had a great document there with that triangle, but it was a little hard for me to see it in a couple of different directions. But it reminded me of a document that we have used for a number of years to produce a visual for people to think about. And this is what we call the instructional use of GIS. There will be a point or two from inside the Mapping Hours zone in the resources section. We'll include a link to that. But that whole idea that Tom was describing, one of the pieces that is so exciting about GIS is that you can use GIS effectively for instruction in all these different strategies. The piece that people see that is enticing, exciting, is when they see a cool project and they say, I want to do that. Get the rest of this out of the way. Teach me which button do I click to do that kind of a project. And what we've been trying to help you see with this particular episode 16 and 17 is that it's important to go through a series of stages of thinking about some of these things. And when somebody goes to the high end too quickly, that ends up being a frustrating experience because they may not know how to do some things. Conversely, for a standard classroom teacher, somebody who focuses on the lower level direct instruction too long, that ends up being boring. And so what we've encouraged people to think about is rise up this scale. And you'll notice that the colors on the front face of this graphic, there's a blend. So it's not really like there's a sharp jump all the time. sometimes it's really hard to tell when you're going from one into the other. And sometimes you can go from, in one classroom, from a presentation into a little bit of a scripted process for students to follow, and then up into a sort of a directed project, and then up into a custom activity, even all in the same class, or maybe even during the same week, and then back down as they get into some new content. This document will help you think about the long-term impact of it. I love that Tpac model to think about teaching and how do we get all three elements engaged in one. Well, that was the design of the competition, this ArcGIS online competition for high school and middle school students, was really built to give students the chance to show what they can do, to sink their teeth into something of their own choosing. And it really begins with a vision of, we want students to engage in their own project and follow it in their direction, but everybody across the country to be able to do this on an equal footing. And so the competition is designed that students will work on something that is inside the bounds of their state, the geographic bounds. Now, people in Rhode Island may have a little less opportunity than people in Alaska for variety, but by the same token, Rhode Island students may have an easier time zeroing in on a project, where Alaska students may have way too many choices. But then you do a project and you submit it to the school, and the school picks their 5 best and submits it to the state, and the state picks their 5 best high school and 5 best middle school projects and submits them to Esri, and we pick a winner from the high school and a winner from the middle school project, and that we would bring them somehow to the Esri conference. Now, you can see the 2019 winners, the high school and middle school students, talking with Jack Dangerman, president of Esri, and you can see the teachers of these high school and middle school students. Teachers and parents out there, encourage your students to engage in it, because the skills that students engage in with this project, that's what people are doing in their GIS jobs. Now, not everybody participated in 2019. You can click on this and see that, hey, there were some folks that were, some states that were represented and some states that were not. So here, Minnesota, wow, they had 131 entries from 10 different schools. California walked away with the most entries, 150 from 7 different schools, high schools and middle schools. Other states was a lot harder to get entries from. So what's happening in 2020? We've got some different states that are participating, and people are still working on their projects, and everybody can still do this. Well, all of the participating states, and any states that aren't participating this year can be thinking about doing this for next year. But what we're really excited to see is that everybody can participate in building some of these story maps just for their own benefit. A school can have their own project competition. A teacher can have his or her own competition. A little neighborhood, now that we're in isolation mode, well, wait a second, how do we do a neighborhood? We could have a neighborhood that spreads across the country, the people who are interested in this particular topic. Lots of ways of thinking about how you can get students engaged in it. But I really want to encourage you to take a look at some of the ones that have been in the top couple of projects, the best at the high school level, best at the middle school level for the past 3 years. And this is a look at the results from the 2019, 2018, and 2017. And notice this is being presented is a story map. This is in the classic template. This is the map journal style. Here you get to see the 2019 results. California and Minnesota had the bulk of the entries across the country. And there were each year winners and honorable mentions selected from the participating states. And so in 2019, you got to see winners from Michigan and Minnesota and honorable mentions from Washington State and California. Then you can see the full results. So here's 2019, and you can see the high school and middle school winners and honorable mentions. Esri supports this. We want to have 5 winners at the state level, at the high school level, and 5 at the middle school level. The best in each state gets a star, and the awardees earn a prize. It's the same prize. It's just that, okay, the state is going to nominate 1 winner at the high school and 1 winner at the middle school level to go in for that national competition. So you can see the 2019, 2018, 2017 model, slightly different color scheme. So we want people to be participating in this. And let's take a look at the high school winner from 2019. Remember, this is before the new story map template had been released. So this is using what we call a bulleted list. There are all kinds of quarries in his county, and he wanted to take a look at what's the impact here. And then a live search process where you get to look for it. And he's using, actually, this is a story map template. This is a spyglass story map where you're looking for, wow, that's not a lake, that's a quarry. Ah, I see. And you can follow around and see where else might there be a quarry. Well, gee, I should have to think about this. The next tab will reveal all 8 quarry locations around the county. And so what you're seeing is Monroe County, Michigan. So this is a live map, and you get to explore the topography. Wow, here's one of the quarries. And as you go zoom in, you can look at it and see, oh my God, these lines, these are contour lines. And so he's looking at LiDAR data the LiDAR data was used to generate the contours. These are 1-foot changes in ground elevation. So there's all kinds of information built within these. It's exciting to look at. The middle school student put together one that will harken back to a story that Joseph was doing back in episode, let me think, must have been episode 6 or 8, or this was way back here, where it was this Legionnaires disease. And there's Dr. John Snow, the story there. And so this student walked through the whole process of doing the research, figuring out what's the area, where are the victims, where are the possible cooling towers that might be related to what they were suffering from, Legionnaires disease. and where's the one that makes the most sense? And they went in and checked the water, and sure enough, that was a big deal. Building these skills, building not just the technical skills, but the thinking skills, the how do I get there, and how do I design my research to support this thing, and then how do I wrap it all up? It's a wonderful package of skills. And so I encourage people to do little projects. Don't do the big one right away. Don't climb Mount Everest as your first thing after you've decided to go hiking. Let's do something that is a small, doable project, and then a bigger one, and then a bigger one. And that way you can build appropriate experience. And sometimes the best way to get some of this experience is to look through a lot of projects and evaluate what's really good in this project or that one. We've raced through story maps and projects. You've gotten to see some work with that classic template, that really powerful template. I love the new template because it's got all of the pieces in there and it's so mobile friendly. And you've gotten to see some classic templates, thinking about project design and the competition as a way to see what it is that students can do. You'll be surprised at what middle school students are able to do. And high school students, take a look at the classic story maps just for ideas of some strategies for approaching content and at just learning some things. There's some wonderful, deep, rich presentations back there. Use the new template. You'll find it very easy to adapt to. And in fact, the technology changes and it's very fast changing. So keep your knees bent, be able to ride the bumps, new opportunities, new possibilities that come all the time. And you may even decide to be thinking mobile first. How much time do students spend on their phone devices as opposed to larger screen devices? Learn from the examples that you can see. Where do you get to go to see some of these things? Once again, here's the address for the classic story maps. And here are the resources for the current template. Go in, check these out because these are very helpful. You can see the two story maps that I pulled up here about the school competition, both the one single template and then the collection, the 3 years of results. Over on the side, you'll find links to blog items about story maps. You'll find things within the Geo projects. The Teach With site and Learn site are filled with activities that lead to story maps. Learn about this tool and present your findings in a story map. The training site has all kinds of information about how to do story maps more powerfully. And as was mentioned by Tom, episode 18 and the next day, episode 19, we're going to take some deep dives in so that you can hear how we who are accustomed to doing some of these projects think about how to integrate our tools to work on a special topic, a special task. How do we walk through working with these tools? What's going on in our heads as we're working on these? Why did we make some of the choices that we did? Because that's the style of thinking that you're going to need to be engaging is, how do I problem solve? How do I take advantage of all of these different components, these different elements? So we'll see you then. Thanks for being here. That's it for today. Bye-bye.
Take care.